Good afternoon, it's Joyful Hermit. I'm going to talk a little bit. I've found this, I think he's a blessed now or in the process. Jeronimo Gracian. This is what Dr. Wilhelmsen started talking about in part, and I have been unaware of his presence that much in Teresa of Avila's life. But it turns out he was a very holy man, 30 years younger than her, a priest. And he also got his doctorate, I think by the time he was 24 years old. He was very bright. He was the third of 20 sons born to his mother and father. And he was an amazing, talented, gifted young man. And lived, I think, until maybe 1614 or 1616. He lived about 6 months after she was beatified, which he was thrilled. They were very, very, very close. Teresa of Avila even made this comment that in general, just any nun could not be allowed a love like that. But she was. And she met him when she was much older, in her 60s. And she just, they were spiritual soulmates in a big way. And she wrote many, many, many letters to him. So many that this other priest that he was with for a while became envious that he got so many letters from Teresa. And he wrote to her, but his life took a turn after she died in 1582. And terrible things happened to him. That's why I'm just astounded and want to talk about Jeronimo Gracian. It would in English look like Jeronimo Gracian, but spelled with a J. And he was instrumental in the reform, actually, very instrumental. They met, I think it was about 1570 something, in that range. She started her first convent in 1562, got permission, and she was given by her bishop this sort of rundown house in Avila. And she called it St. Joseph. Her first convent was St. Joseph. But she did not get in earnest in the reform to the point where others were very, very angry with her until later. And then I think I might have said she did 13 houses. I had read that someplace, but instead it was 16. And 17 are attributed to her, but one was started by someone else, but they include 17. But 2 were for men, and the rest were for women, but directly attributed to her direct involvement in setting up these foundations or these convents or monasteries. And they're just small. 13 at the maximum she wanted. 12, and then probably based on the apostles, 12, and then the Mother Superior, or the abbot, or whatever would be called, the superior for the men. So she was an amazing woman and very talented. She was tended to be outspoken. I remember reading one thing that she took a priest to task who was having an affair with a nun. Really let him have it. And she also had strong words for a bishop later on. A couple of bishops, in fact. If they were doing wrong and not building up the church, but rather tearing it down by their own behaviors, or not living a holy life, she would approach them and tell them directly. She did not hold back. I remember when I was first Catholic, I'd hear people say, never say an ill word against a priest, against the holy priest. Well, they do have quite a charge from God. They're given a major charge of being priests and to be holy. But we all have our responsibility to God. And so we are responsible for God, to God. Anyway, Gracian was very gregarious. He was from an aristocratic family, and Teresa thought very, very highly of him. And he was her confessor for a while. She had other confessors in her life earlier on. Understand again that he was 30 years younger than Teresa, born 30 years after. So he was a confessor of her when she was later in life. They were very, very close, not in any bad way at all, just spiritual soulmates. Inspired each other and loved each other with a filial friendship love, very deep spiritual love, and that of brother and sister, but just got along great. Really, really had a rare friendship. And I didn't realize that. I wasn't that aware of how close she was to him. And for those years. And then, let's see, he met her in a foundation in Toledo that she had founded in 1577. She met him there, and also at about the same time, John of the Cross escaped from prison there. And that's also in Toledo where Teresa wrote Maraudus. And another thing I didn't notice about Teresa is I always thought that she was more accepted and sort of had fame and leadership once she started the foundations, the different monasteries, the convents. But she went through a terrible time herself and wasn't appreciated after a while. Some by the other sisters in the Encarnacion, the 180 sisters who did not want a change in the convent system. They wanted it to stay a gay old time and prestigious. They didn't want to do the hard work of coming close to God, of what it is. It is hard work to develop a relationship, a love relationship, and to get to know the other person, the object of your love and affection. Well, that's what we do if we want to get close to God. It takes effort, and it takes zeal and focus and great desire and a willingness to give up other things, to give up a lot of the world, and to have that, what Jesus called that single-minded focus, single-mindedness of purpose, of love of God above all things, all else, and love of others and ourselves as God loves in his type of love, which is a pure love, very forgiving love, and an unconditional type love. However, there are consequences, though. God does let us have our consequences for our sins and for our wrongdoings. That just happens because it's the world. We sin in the world, and there'll be consequences that come to us from what we've done or what we've said. But Teresa, at about 1576 or so, people were really turning on her, and higher ups were. Even a king had turned on her. And, well, social pressure, political pressures, lots of religious people became very upset. She had already done some of the reform, but she wasn't as outward about it. And there weren't as many houses. It hadn't spread into the men's yet. But when it did, it was about 1577 when John of the Cross was imprisoned by his own fellow friars. They put him in, I think it was a 4 by 6 foot cell. Very small, narrow, just one little opening at the top, way up high. A little grill that fresh air could get in. And of course the door would open, and the jailer, one of the brothers, one of the priests, in the regular order of the Carmelites, the Carmelite regulars, not the Reformed, not the discalced, which means shoeless, without shoes, which was what they were nicknamed because they were more austere. This reform spread. Gracian was in on it, as it turns out, and John of the Cross. Teresa started it, but they joined in and helped with the men, and Gracian helped her with ideas and with focus, and encouraged her, I think, in 4 or 5 additional towns in the area to set up another convent. And another reason why people got on her is that she believed in poverty and in not charging people. Like the sisters would come in poverty. They didn't have to pay their way in. Their parents didn't have to provide for them all through the years in luxuries. They weren't going to have luxuries. They were getting down to business of the spiritual life, like Jesus was. They say, he had no home. Well, he did for a while in Capernaum. I doubt he owned it, but someone let him stay there or whatever. But otherwise, he wandered. It says, no place to lay his head. He was, his mission was greater. And that was what Teresa wanted. And her main idea of the reform was doing penance for all the sins of the world that all of us people do. And in that time period, in Spain and all over Europe, the church had really gone lax, and convents and monasteries had. People were very lax about religion and about following Christ. So it was practically dissolved. Lukewarm Christianity to an extreme. Practically cold, tepid, it was just milquetoast Christianity. And she devised this goal of living life, of making reparation for all the sins of everyone that had caused this to happen to the church and to our souls, to our religious lives. And we could have that to this very day. We see what's going on in society. Those of us who want to get serious and give ourselves fully to God and our lives, live them all for God and attain to this pure love, the pure love that God is. That would be a worthy goal, a worthy purpose, is to make reparation for our sins and everybody's sins. Because there's lots of people who aren't interested in the spiritual life and in Christ and the scriptures and trying to live. And we don't, lots of people just don't get excited like we do about these things and aren't willing to give up. And I have to admit, I'm weak. I just ate, it's the last one I had. I've had them for over, I think it's been a year and a half. Some chocolate bars. And I have been so tired, I just needed a big sugar boost. And I think it's just loaded with fructose. But I ate the last of those chocolate bars. And, but I have come to realize that the types of sacrifice that are of utmost importance are those within me. It's not giving up a candy bar. It's my attitude. And one of our viewers, his childhood, well, there's another one. Several of you have had just terrible abuse by parents and family members, older brothers or a father or parents or siblings, and or a combination thereof, and but yet are striving and have good attitudes and have forgiven the abusers, the people who were to protect them and love them, abused them in various ways, terrible. And one ruined the man's life. His spine is just ruined. And he's still young, 64, so that attitude of purity and of love and always building up others, even though his life was so taken down, ruined in a temporal way to be able to do much of anything. The memory is suffering because of all the pain and depression. And that struck me the other day tremendously, of my attitude, my complaining, and being negative and getting frustrated over things. Well, yes, the pain will make me do it, but other people's pain, you viewers, the pains you've had, emotional and physical and mental pains, terrible things, that I realize I need to sacrifice my bad attitude, change my ways, deeper conversion, uplift others, and be grateful, stop my complaining. And so just like that means more than if I give up a candy bar and I had to do something. I needed a big endorphin boost, and I had already taken some extra pain med, and I don't want to. I mean, you sign a pain contract with a pain doctor, and I take it seriously. I don't like to go against it, although I know if I would call and say, I'm having a terrible day, they will go ahead and take a little more. But they're busy, and usually you have to leave a message, and it would be hours before. So I self-medicated with this Nestle Crunch bar. Anyway, what Teresa went through astounded me, because I'd always thought of her in the category of those that were utilized and not mistreated because they did such great things for the church. But in her time period, things went along sort of undercover for a while. The sisters in the convent, the monastery of the Incarnation, they ran her out, and the 3 other sisters that joined her. And she also had a couple of nieces join her, 2 or 3. So there were like 6 or 7 of them that started this St. Joseph's convent. But they ran her out and were going to kill her. Ran her literally out of that convent one night. There were 180 angry women who resented what she was doing, uproot, trying to, who did she think she was, being all religious. And also she insisted that they go in poverty, and that if someone donated a house to them or a building, or they could get it for very little, and someone wanted to donate through almsgiving and help them purchase a property, like she had a very wealthy patron who got her, I forget which town it was, bought her a house. It was an old dilapidated place, but used her money so Teresa could have it. But they were determined not to do the dowry system, that the sisters themselves had to be wealthy in order to be religious. And so they all took their vows of poverty seriously. And that even angered people in the church, bishops and priests, because they were used to their system. Their system had more control over the convents because they were, it was done through money. People had to buy their way in. And it kept it at a certain class of people, the wealthy. And then that would bring more donations also to the diocese through these wealthy families, that their daughters were nuns, basically bought into being a nun. So that disrupted that whole way of doing things, and they didn't like it. People didn't like it. Upsetting the apple cart, so to speak. So it was in 1577, John was imprisoned in his monastery and beaten and nearly starved to death. He escaped miraculously 9 months later. But she was told by one of the kings or some leader, some big leader, and bishop, told her that she had to resign and retire from no more convent starting, no more leading anything. And she was to go to her house. They said, you have to pick one of your houses and go stay there, basically under house arrest. I'd forgotten about this years ago, that I'd learned this little bit, but I read more about it recently. So she chose St. Joseph's in Toledo. There was a St. Joseph's she loved St. Joseph's in Avila and a St. Joseph's in Toledo. So she went there and she wrote muradas there. Some kind of writings that she wrote. She was basically was not to be doing anything, not to be corresponding, she was basically, like I say, under house arrest. She was done, they said. She was done. Well, she wrote some letters, though. She wrote to King Philip, and it would have been 2 years later, in 1579. He had always been fond of her, this king had. It was a different one than the one that had told her she was finished and put under house arrest. So told her she had to stay put and go underground, and that was that for her. She was done with her religious work and efforts. So, but she wrote, and this King Philip, Philip the Fourth or something, he took pity on her and opened the way with others, with some bishops, to allow her to come out and be active again. So she died in 1582. She, I think, did 4 more convents and maybe one of the men's houses, foundations in that time period. And she was stricken very ill in one of her journeys. So, and then she died after that. But all these years, though, that she had been alive, these last 5 years or 5 or 6 years. She was very, very close to Gracian, Jeronimo Gracian. And he was so talented. She had such wonderful things to say about him. And Gracian thought that the reform should be taken to Seville. Saint Teresa did not want to go there, but he got a foundation started there, and she went. She went to get it supervised and built up and going well. A novice who left betrayed the Seville convent. So Saint Teresa had to go and defend herself at the Inquisition. It got very messy. And I had forgotten about that it was Philip II was her benefactor, basically, the one who saved her, brought her back out from being held down, retired. And but she was in the Inquisition. She was being questioned by them. And it had to do with this novice who had left the reform and passed terrible rumors about Teresa, to the point where she was being questioned and her life was in danger. She could have been guillotined or burned. They would burn them also, because of what they thought was a betrayal on her part. Thank God she wasn't. But during this time, it was during this time also that in 1577, a couple of years before that Inquisition bit, or during that time period, that John of the Cross suddenly disappeared. Well, that was when he was imprisoned. And that's when Teresa started writing to Philip II, and he defended their cause of reforming the Carmelites, the men and the women. And having Gracian with them was very beneficial. He was extremely well thought of in his life. So young man. And Teresa hadn't met a soul like his at all. She talked about it. She was in awe. He had a tremendous soul. He was very talented with theology, gifted with spiritual life. Automatically, he had his master's at age 19, master's degree, and his doctorate and was a priest by age 24. Brilliant, hardworking, creative mind, naturally gifted in many aspects, very, very personable. He could be firm. Everyone wanted him as a confessor, to preach. They had him preaching all over, writing books. He wrote many books. He's the one who wrote got her life. She did her own autobiography. And he's the one that wrote of other books about her and made sure that her interior, worked on it, improved her interior castles, and got the interior castle, and got that published. The Way of Perfection, several other things. Her foundations, she'd written about those, and he would edit them, work on them also after she had died, and got them all published. That was also what he did for her, because he knew how special she was, what an unusual soul for the times and for all of history, really. But let's see, that's what, so Philip II came to the rescue, and they actually, and John then, after 9 months, escaped, barely with his life, from his own monastery, the Carmelite regulars. because the men were very angry. They took action on him daily, beating him, ridiculing, starving him, keeping him in prison. They would bring him out and sit him in the middle of the refectory where they would eat. All of them would be eating at the table. He'd have to sit in the middle of the floor. They would ridicule him. They would go take turns hitting him, give him like a crust of bread to chew on, a little water. That was it. And it's just horrific to think. Catholics, people, Christians, acting like that against someone for wanting to be more serious about the religious life. It's really hard, but we see persecution. It happens in our time. People who are more serious about their religious life are put down, let me tell you. And if you're trying to do a lot of good and trying to include other people, help keep the fire burning. As Jesus said, he wished it was burning already. But if you try to help fan the flames of religious fervor and do good and start programs that are good, people get bothered and they start to persecute those who don't want to. They don't understand. They don't have to. But they resent it because it makes them look bad in their own mind. They think these others who are striving are making them look bad. So if they can tear those people down or get rid of them, problem solved. So it's in our day, though, they're not starving each other to death, but it can get pretty brutal in groups, organizations. So even today, so the Gracian and Mother Teresa, or Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross, they decided they wanted legal separation from the Carmelite, to start their discalced Carmelite as a legal separated entity of its own, separated from the Carmelite regulars, as they came to be called. So they wrote a brief of separation from the Carmelites of the observance. That came in 1579, and it gave them the status of a separate province. Well, Gracian was so young still then, in 1579. He was born in 1545. So how old would he be? Would he have been? He was 29 years old. He was elected to be the superior general, the provincial, the one in charge of this whole new province of Carmelites, of the discalced Carmelites, because he was a very talented leader and had a wonderful way with people. Firmness, yet kindness, and could always explain the reason for things and put people at ease. So he was elected to be in charge of, did they have 17 foundations? And of course, many more. And of the whole movement, he was the provincial director of it all. In October of 1582, it was October 4th, Teresa died in Alba de Tormes. That was the town that's up a little northwest of Avila. And she's buried there, or she was buried there, but her body has been all distributed, different body parts to different places. So what's in the convent there now is I think it's her right arm and her heart. I've already told you about her transverberated heart is there, and you can see it. but I'd forgotten about her arm. But her arm is also in a container, a glass container, or see-through that you can see, glass of some sort. And but other body parts are in other cities in Spain. And at one time, her burial spot was someplace else, but they've moved. I think it's back in Alba, the rest of her body. But in the convent, there is her arm and her heart. She started in 1571 the Alba de Tormes Foundation, and relatives funded it. Her relatives paid for it. They would accept gifts from people, but they didn't charge. They didn't make the women pay, and that broke up the system of only a certain social status who could be in a convent. It opened it up to anyone who desired and was called by God. So she did many great changes in what had really broken down for about 2 to 3 centuries. So now there's the Discalcid Carmelites and the Chalcid Carmelites. They just go by Carmelite and Discalcid. They have their own liturgical rites. The Roman rite was revised shortly before St. John of the Cross's death. He died after Teresa died. He was much younger. He was 51 when he died. But he had been in poor health since his imprisonment. And his, there was a man named Doria, a priest, and he had become the leader or the provincial of the regular Carmelites. Of course, he did not like John at all. He envied him, in fact. He envied his holiness. But he mistreated John even at the end of his life. Doria wanted to have the Roman rite incorporated to the Carmelites, but John of the Cross opposed this. He wanted to keep their rites separate. The regular Carmelites would have their rite, and the Roman rite would come and be in with the Discalcid Carmelites. They'd revised it, and wanted to keep even their way of Mass different then. So they wanted a lot of separation. But what John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and Jeronimo Gracian wanted was meaningful, more spiritual, in their masses, in their reform, in their rules, the rule of how they were going to live, the goal, the reason they were doing what they were doing was a deeply religious cause, reparation for everyone's sins, for how the church had devolved. And so a little bit more about, this goes into John of the Cross here, this part. I want to talk more about Gracian, though. Teresa dies, and Gracian's life had been people appreciating him, honors, provincial of this new order of Carmelites, the Discalcid Carmelites that was growing rapidly. It's amazing how many people, when it's okay, when it's finally approved, really want something that has purpose and meaning. All of a sudden, the regular Carmelites were losing people. And to this day, you hear more about the Discalcid Carmelites. They're the ones we think of. But I was aware of a Carmelite convent. I think it's in Cleveland, Ohio. That was a regular one, because I was stunned. They would just come and go and did what they wanted. And it turns out it was their regular. I didn't realize there were still regular Carmelites around. Also, I think in California there was one that I was aware of then. That was very loose, very lax. And so that's just, but there's the ones that we're most familiar with are the ones that Teresa started, but with a lot more help in the final 5 years from Gracian, more than I had ever known, and John of the Cross also assisted with the men's part of it, as did Gracian with the men's part. But Gracian would help Teresa with the plans and the thinking through. He had a very sharp mind, and she did too, but he had so much education with a doctorate on top of being a priest that he was able, in the basis of theology, he was able to help her to include in what she was writing the different rule and the moralis that she would, or moradas, he would help her make sure it was very theologically sound and based on God and study of God, and on meaningful rules and ways that they would live, and regular, what would happen if something happened, how would that be dealt with, problem solving, things like that. And they worked beautifully together. But when she was then sent to Toledo, and Gracian was out, he would go out preaching, very popular and honored, had a lot of honor. And then he had to travel a lot since he was provincial. And that was in 1579. He was elected as provincial of these 17 different houses, foundations. So he had to do a lot of traveling around Spain. This mostly the northern part, Castile and above, and check on all of these different convents and monasteries, hear confessions. He was a great confessor, so he did a lot of that work and preaching. So, but when she died, things changed beyond what Teresa would have ever imagined, or he would have imagined happened to him. John was busy, at first getting the more of the men's foundations going, but he was so persecuted by Doria, this priest, last name was Doria, Doria, and really died at his hands. But he did ask forgiveness. This Doria asked John's forgiveness the day before he died. But he was very vindictive and brutal, and kept putting John in places that ordered him to go in places that were very detrimental to his already weakened health, after being nearly starved to death and beaten and stuck in that little tiny cell for 9 months before he miraculously escaped. He escaped right. He was getting ready to die. He was within days of death. And so just I like to think of him in better times, and his beautiful writings, his poetry. And then the sisters asked him to explain the poems. They were so deep, they couldn't readily understand. So he wrote, and that's what's in the collected works, is all his explanation. The poems are there, but also the bulk of it are the explanations. It's excellent reading. You'll learn a lot. John was very gifted in that way. But and Gracian did his own writing, but he's credited with getting Teresa's things published, all about her and that time period and her interior castle. He made sure that got published. But he was turned upon by many sides and factors and people. He was imprisoned twice, Gracian was, just in a regular prison with common criminals tossed in. But he had this spirit of evangelization that was like you viewers, just strong and positive, so in love with God. As Teresa of Avila said, she had never met a soul like his and had never loved anyone like she loved him. It was a holy love. And that's why she made the statement that, it wouldn't be allowed by most nuns to have that. It was rare, that kind of love, to have a spiritual soulmate with someone that they just clicked. From the first time they met, they could discuss any spiritual topic. Now, John of the Cross taught Teresa a lot. She was a teacher, but he taught her also. Gracian was a spiritual friend, a spiritual love even of holiness. Their love of God was so strong. Now with John of the Cross, she and John levitated. In the convent, they show the two chairs they were on when they levitated several feet up in the air and were like that for a few hours. They had gone into ecstasy, each of them, and levitated. And they were observed by the religious sisters, because John was their confessor for a while of one of the convents, one of the foundations. But Gracian was more of just a private friend. He would consult with her, guide. He was her confessor those 5 years. And prior to that, though, John of the Cross was. I just had never realized the significance of Gracian in her life, the last 5 years of her life. So, but he was put into prison. In prison, some of the criminals, they would get into tiffs with each other and want to cut each other's noses off, or cut someone's nose off, or cut an ear off. That was what they would do to be aggressive against the other prisoners. And Gracian, in his good way with people, he would, some people who were thrown in jail were Christians and they had money. And their family members would bring them money to jail, give them money, and then they would give that to Gracian. He had a way. And then he would pay these criminals money to not cut off someone's ear. He accepted alms for that purpose. It boggles our mind. Of course, now prisoners will kill other prisoners. They do. There's still the same horrible stuff going on. But there's not a Gracian in prison. There's not a holy man tossed in for being holy, basically, and for being the kind of person that these others resented. These hoo-hoos, different bishops and priests and rulers would resent, because they all of a sudden realized that the reform was hurting them, financially mostly, in some ways. All these wealthy families weren't pouring money in to keep their daughters there, which of course not all the money went for their food. They, would trickle back to the dioceses, and so different time periods. But we have lots of stuff in our time period that isn't right. And that's why these saints are important for us to focus on. and to realize we can do that ourselves, with ourselves. If we've been in a parish that is milquetoast, or what did I used to call it? Popcorn Catholicism, or Catholicism light. And there isn't much of spiritual life going on. No Bible studies, no scripture study, no group discussions of meatier topics or good books being read and discussed. Instead, more Catholic writers who write fiction or contemporary books that are political even. If we want something more, we can do it on our own. We can do our own. We can have our own reform ourselves. So, but Gracian really had a terrible time of it. I just had no idea that he was so mistreated. But he made it through. And there's now, I have a hope. Anyway, I won't get into anything more about Gracian, but it's just amazing the hardships that I didn't realize that these holy people had. Some I know about, but like obviously Joan of Arc, but I had no idea that those who I always thought were real popular and looked up to, but they were mistreated also, very much mistreated. So that's about Gracian and Teresa. And these next, I have lots of notes here from the class about John of the Cross. Gracian, John of the Cross died when he was 51. Gracian lived through the 90s. He was mistreated through the 90s, 96 to 99, 1596 to 1599. Like I say, he was imprisoned twice. And for being a good person, for being a holy leader. 1614, he was very pleased that he could live long enough to see Teresa of Avila beatified. And then 6 months later, he died. But it wasn't too long after he came back into prominence then, later on, of being very well regarded. A brilliant man, and various things that he wrote. You can even look, there's books about him and his relationship with Teresa. But so there's lots of ideas that are known about Gracian. Anyway, just another person who was a great person, did much good for God and the church, and for anyone who wanted to grow in holiness. They're exemplars. They are ones that we can look to and realize their courage, and even with their imprisonments, Gracian was always upbeat and positive, helping other prisoners and keeping them from being mutilated by other prisoners. He would take the money he would be given and buy off these cruel mistreatments to protect people from having their ears and noses cut off. It's barbaric, but it happened. It's real life. So God bless His real presence in us, and it's an honor for us to be able to know these people and ask their intercessions. Ask them to pray for us. I have been with Gracian and John of the Cross, his beautiful writings, and the hard work they put in. the hard work of helping us to have these great writings and to understand levels of prayer. And that another thing that Teresa had said about prayer, people ask, well, why did she stop praying in her later years? Like the last 10 years, Teresa of Avila stopped praying. Well, she explains, love suffices, she said. Love. Love is the prayer. You don't need words. When you get to a certain point in your spiritual life with God, your love is the prayer. I thought that was very, very good. To love God to the degree that your love becomes the prayer. Wordless praying. God bless His real presence in us, and talk to you another time.